When Oliva's brother called the newspaper to ask about the cost of announcing the births of 5 babies, he had no idea of the crazy roller coaster ride that this innocent question would send his family on. A ride that would ultimately lead to the creation of something that no one could have possibly ever predicted. A literal zoo for children. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. Okay, so I tried to tease this episode at the end of last week's episode, but so many of you guys were in my comments suggesting this case. I was surprised that so many of you guys had heard about this case. I honestly had not heard about it until I was doing research for last week's episode about the baby incubators and the World Fair and all of that. And this has got to be just as fascinating as that story. So let's get right into it. It's 1934 in Callander, Ontario, Canada. 24-year-old Elzire Dionne and her husband Oliva have 5 children at home, and a 6th had died in infancy. Elzire's pregnant again, but something feels different this time. She's starting to suspect that baby number 7 might also be baby number 8. But you can only imagine her shock when Elzire went into labor 2 months early and delivered not 1, not 2, but 5 babies. Yvonne was first, followed by Annette, Cecile, Emile, or Emily. I believe her name is actually Emily, but there are multiple different newsreels that call her Emile or Emilie. And I think that might partly be because when you say Emily in French, it kind of sounds like Emilie, and so there may be some confusion there. And then Marie. Collectively, they would become known as the Dionne Quintuplets. And altogether, they weighed only 13 pounds and 6 ounces. The largest weighed 2.5 pounds and the smallest weighed 1 pound, 8.5 ounces. None were longer than 9 inches. And while their individual measurements and weights were never written down, each one of these babies were so tiny that they could fit into the palm of your hand. The odds of something like this occurring naturally are crazy. We're talking 1 in 55 to 57 million for naturally occurring quintuplets. To make this even crazier, doctors suspected these girls were identical. Now, the odds of identical quintuplets are considered incalculable due to the random nature of twinning. But ultimately, through genetic testings, doctors were able to confirm that yes, all 5 of these girls had come from a single egg that had split. Each of the sisters had shared an amniotic sac with one of the other quintuplets, except for one sister. And there's where there's one additional little twist to this incredibly unusual pregnancy. When Elzire was about 12 weeks pregnant, she had passed what doctors believe was a 6th baby that she had miscarried. Of course, at that time, they didn't know that she was pregnant with 6 babies, but now that we have all of the rest of the details, it made perfect sense. Now, back during that time period, there wasn't much prenatal care happening, especially out in rural Canada. But Elzire's doctor, Dr. Alan DaFoe, had noted her complications, which included things like fluid retention and anemia, and he had begun to suspect that something might not be quite normal at this delivery, noting that her baby may have some type of fetal abnormality. So, when Elzire went into labor in the middle of the night, her husband, Oliva, called in 2 local midwives for help. They delivered the first 2 babies together, and Dr. DaFoe made it in time to assist with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th births. As soon as the babies were born, they were wrapped in whatever they could find. Cotton sheets, old napkins. They weren't expecting 5 babies after all. And then they were laid at the corner of the bed. After giving birth, Elzire immediately went into shock. I mean, honestly, that seems like the most appropriate reaction in this situation. So Dr. DaFoe turns all his attention to Elzire, and up to this point, there had been no record of quintuplets having ever survived past a few days. Most didn't make it past a few hours, and so Dr. DaFoe knew that Elzire had the best chance of survival, and he does his best to try and save her. Luckily, after 2 hours, she made it through the worst and had recovered. In the meantime, the 2 midwives had been looking after the babies, and they had them all snuggled up in a wicker basket covered with heated blankets. They were taken into the kitchen and set by the open door of the stove to keep warm. One by one, they were taken out of the basket and massaged with olive oil. No one expected these babies to survive. All the odds were stacked against them. In addition to being born 2 months early, in the 1930s, they also lived basically out in the middle of nowhere in a farmhouse with no electricity or running water. But despite all of that, Dr. DaFoe and the midwives did their very best to give these babies the best shot they could. Their early care was based on common sense and making do with what was available. Dr. DaFoe ordered the babies to be fed a mixture of cow's milk, sterilized water, and corn syrup. They were fed every 2 hours, and to everyone's surprise, they made it past the first 24 hours. On day 2, they were moved to a slightly larger laundry basket and kept warm with hot water bottles. Still, they needed constant care. One minute they'd be fine, and the next minute they would turn blue and have trouble breathing. So the nurses would literally revive these babies by giving them a 10-part water to 2-part rum mixture. So in the last episode, we had a little discussion speculating about this rum mixture that was given to premature babies back in the day. And the speculation was kind of like, maybe this mixture was given to the babies because of the false understanding that alcohol warms the body. Of course, we know that's not the case now. We know that it only makes your skin feel warm and it doesn't actually raise your body's temperature. And so we were just kind of thinking, people used to think that, so maybe that was a reason. But as it turns out, this rum cocktail was being given to premature babies, not necessarily for warmth, but to rouse them. At least that's what it was in this case. Their little bodies would get tired of breathing and kind of just stop, and the rum was being used as a stimulant to get the body to start breathing again. One of the nurses said that it was a constant around-the-clock thing in those early days. She said that as soon as one baby was being revived and turning from blue back to a nice pink shade, one of the other babies would start struggling, and so the cycle went around the clock. She also talked about how when the babies were first born and they didn't have names yet, they would call the girls A, B, C, D, and E until, of course, they were officially named. It was nothing short of a miracle that these girls survived, kept warm by the oven, hot water bottles, and even heated bricks until proper incubators were found. As it turns out, these girls are the only identical quintuplets ever recorded, even to this very day, and they were the first known quintuplets to survive infancy. Both the nurses and Dr. DaFoe gained international fame for their part in keeping the Dionne Quintuplets alive. Dr. DaFoe was an experienced second-generation physician who had been practicing medicine in Callender since 1909. But he was just a local country physician who could never have expected that these babies were about to make him a very famous, very rich man. While the Dionne Quintuplets were fighting for their lives in those first few days, Oliva's brother runs to the local newspaper in Callender to ask about how much it would cost to print an announcement about 5 babies being born at once. Basically, he's like, hey, this is only one birth announcement, but they're 5 babies, so was this going to cost more money or what? Now, this is a small town because the guy who was handling the ads was also the one who was writing the stories, and so when he hears this, he's like, what? Wait, what? 5 babies at the same time? He could not believe this. This was something he had to see for himself. So instead of a birth announcement, he decides to write a full-blown story about these quintuplets, sends it out on the newswire. and it goes 1930s viral, getting picked up by newspapers all across Canada and the United States. According to newspaper stories from that time, there had only ever been 30 recorded quintuplet births in the past 500 years, and every single one of those babies had died within 24 hours. By making it past even 1 day old, these babies had already beat the odds, and they had the whole continent talking. Meanwhile, back at the Dionne family's farmhouse, things are chaotic. Additional nurses were called in from the Canadian Red Cross to help with the constant care that the babies needed. And then you had the Dionne family completely shocked. Like, imagine going from 5 kids to 10 kids overnight. They were still trying to wrap their heads around this new reality. Now, they weren't exactly living in poverty. They were doing pretty average for that time and place, but like, they didn't have electricity or running water. So I can imagine it was a little tough, even though all of the stories say that they were an average income family and had a pretty nice farmhouse, as rural farmhouses go. So here they were in the middle of the Great Depression, wondering how on earth they were going to afford all of these new babies at once. But they didn't have to worry for long, because the quintuplets were becoming famous overnight. And people from all over North America started sending in offers to help. Supplies, donations, well-meaning advice, it was all pouring in. So the Dionne Quintuplets were born just 2 days before the 1934 World's Fair, which we talked about in my last episode. And there was this newspaper mogul. That's how you say it. Let's say Mongol. Like he's a scoundrel. Anyway, so newspaper mogul William Randolph Hearst hears about the story, and he's like, you have got to get Cooney up there to see those babies. You know, the guy we talked about from the last episode who ran the baby exhibits? Yeah, that guy. So Cooney, he's like, no, I'm kind of taking care of babies of my own over here. I can't make it up there. And so he can't make it, but they know that what the Dionne babies really need is an incubator. So Charles Blake, a reporter with the Chicago American newspaper, finds an old incubator from 1895 that's gas-powered, because of course the Dionnes don't have electricity, and he sends it up to them in Canada. There's a bit of drama getting it across the border, because the Border Patrol people were like, what is this thing that you're trying to bring into our country? But eventually it does make its way to the farmhouse, and at first they have multiple babies in one incubator. But as more and more donations start to come in, they get a second incubator from the Toronto Star, plus 3 more that someone had built using antique blueprints. Some hospitals get in on the action and donate even more incubators. And even the National Mortgage Company offers to refinance the family's mortgage, which Oliva straight up turns down. But the point is, people were showing up and trying to help this family out. So women all across the country offer their breast milk, and with 5 babies, that was an offer that the Dionnes gladly accepted. The women were paid 10 cents per ounce of breast milk, which ended up being a huge help to their families as well, because many of them were struggling during this time of depression. Once the milk was collected, it was preserved and shipped by train to the quintuplets. And Dr. Alan Brown from Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, that's how you say it? Why does that sound wrong? Why does that sound wrong? Toronto. I knew that was wrong. From Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children made sure that a train with 28 ounces of milk was delivered to the babies every single morning. Meanwhile, Dr. DaFoe was working overtime alongside the Canadian Red Cross to coordinate all of the supplies and donations that were flooding in for the girls. So on May 30th, just 3 days after the quintuplets are born, Oliva is approached by some exhibitors from the Chicago World's Fair. They want to put the quintuplets on their display at the Century of Progress expedition. Now, if you see my last episode, you know that this wasn't exactly unheard of back in those days. In fact, incubator babies were kind of a thing. These exhibits were very popular and were often the only care available to premature babies at that time. And these exhibitors were not playing around. They made Oliva an offer that he just couldn't ignore. They guaranteed him $100 up front, which is about $2,500 in today's money, and then $250 per week after that, which would be about $5,500 today. Talk about a fortune, especially for a guy with 12 mouths to feed. But here's the thing. Oliva didn't just sign the deal on a whim. This was huge and he knew it. So he took it really serious and he went to get advice from two men that he really respected. Dr. DaFoe, the doctor who had delivered the girls and was helping the family with their care, and his local parish priest, Father Daniel Routier. Both of them were like, yeah, seems like a great opportunity. This could be a way to get the girls the care they need, plus help you to feed the rest of your family. The priest even offered to be the family's business manager. Now, under this agreement with the Chicago Fair, 70% of the admission profits would go to the fair promoters, 23% would go to the girl's father, and 7% would go to the parish priest. But this is where things took a turn. Just a day or two after signing this contract, Oliva had a change of heart. He revokes the whole thing. He claimed the contract wasn't valid because his wife had not been there to sign it with him. Now, it's believed that he canceled this contract because of the negative attention that it had brought to him once the public started to find out about it, which I do wonder how they found out about this so quickly. But while some have suggested that people were mad claiming he was exploiting his children, it's now believed that the real reason people were upset is because they knew that his wife was sick through all of this and they just didn't think it was right. That he had made this decision without his wife and the mother of these children having been there. So he revokes the contract and refuses to go through with the plan. But unfortunately, signing that paper in the first place would lead to some long-lasting consequences. So the news about the Dionne Quintuplets is spreading like wildfire, and their fame is already out of control. People are flocking to the small town of Callender by the thousands, all hoping for a quick glimpse of these babies. And the situation is quickly getting pretty chaotic. It's causing a lot of problems for the Dionne family, and on top of that, Oliva is now facing the possibility of a lawsuit for backing out of that Chicago contract with the fair people. So on July 27th of 1934, to try and protect himself and his family from this looming legal mess, and to help with the mountain of medical bills that are piling up for the girls, Oliva and Elzire signed a contract with the Canadian Red Cross. This contract says that it'll cover all the baby's medical costs and in exchange gives guardianship of the girls, who were now about 3 months old, over to the Red Cross for the next 2 years. Ontario's Attorney General, Arthur Roebuck, comes out and makes the statement, which is basically like, look, we can't stop these American guys from coming over and taking Oliva to court over a broken contract, but we're pretty sure that they won't go after the Red Cross. So the Red Cross steps in to take custody of the babies, which is supposed to protect them from this whole mess of the circus people and all of that. And in return, they're covering everything for the girls over the next 2 years while they're in their custody. We're talking nurses' wages, supplies, and making sure that the babies get all of the breast milk that they need. Now, just to show how serious they are, the Red Cross gets started on building an entire hospital just for these 5 babies. They built it right across the street from the Dionne's farmhouse. So, on September 21st, 1934, the DaFoe Hospital and Nursery, yes, it's named after the doctor, well, the hospital's ready, and the babies are moved in. Unfortunately, things took a turn pretty quickly, and it seems like instead of the girls' health, everyone just started trying to figure out how they could cash in on these famous babies. Fred Davis, a photographer from the Toronto Star, signs a contract with the Red Cross that prevents anyone, including the Dionne parents, from taking photos of the babies. Only Fred Davis can photograph the quintuplets. In exchange, $10,000 is put into a trust fund for the babies. A trust fund that starts growing by thousands of dollars each week, thanks to the promotional sales and merchandise that are flying off the shelves, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And this trust fund as well, there's some more details that I'll be discussing throughout this episode because that is a whole thing. In February 1935, Oliva and Elzire decide to head to Chicago and show up on stage as the parents of the world famous babies. I mean, they were certainly judged for this, but the babies were already famous and they probably thought it couldn't hurt to make a little extra money as the parents of these 5 babies. But while they're off doing their whole thing, Premier Mitchell Hepburn in Ontario sees a huge opportunity to get involved. He's like, we can't let these babies be exploited. So let's just go ahead and extend that 2-year guardianship out a little longer by taking them under the Crown's protection. You see, there were these rumors that were going around that when the parents regained custody of the children, they were planning to take the girls on a publicity tour that following summer. Oliva came out and made a statement saying that the rumors weren't true and they had no such plans. Despite this, Premier Mitchell Hepburn claimed that they must save these babies from further exploitation. And so in March of 1935, he pushes through the Dionne Quintuplets Act, which makes the girls official wards of the Crown and extends their guardianship until they turn 18. I did not see that coming. A board of directors is appointed to oversee all business matters for the girls, and this board consists of Dr. DaFoe, of course, Judge Joseph Valin, Minister of Warfare David Kroll, and the Quint's father, Oliva Dionne. But Oliva's seat at the table was merely symbolic, and he had little to no voting power. Honestly, he wasn't able to do much, and so he ended up not really attending most of the meetings because he just didn't see the point. The other 3 men run the show, and so he kind of just excuses himself and lets the other 3 men run the show like they would have done anyway. They meet every month to discuss things like business deals, money management, and the potential opportunities like film appearances and commercials for the quintuplets. Now, as you guys know, the reason these girls were taken away from their parents in the first place was supposedly for their protection and to keep them safe from all those shady promoters. But as soon as the government had control over these girls, they quickly realized just how big the public interest was, and what do? They build an entire tourism industry around these girls, aka the government exploited the heck out of the Dionne Quintuplets. So once the government decides they're going to cash in on the quintuplets' fame, they start letting visitors come in to see the girls. At first, people just kind of looked at the babies through the window in the hospital, but pretty quickly they realized this was a problem because while visitors were asked to stay quiet during their visits, of course, they didn't. And so the Quints would get really excited when visitors would show up, but then they would also get really upset when people would leave. So naturally, they had to upgrade this whole situation. Cue the opening of Quintland on Canada Day of 1936. This place was a whole production. Funded by the Red Cross fundraiser, it included the 9-room nursery that we already talked about, a staff house for the 3 nurses and the 3 policemen who were tasked with guarding them. These buildings were surrounded by a 7-foot barbed wire fence because safety first. And the nurses would also hold the girls up over a balcony to show them to the crowds below. Now, once Quintland is all put together, they build an outdoor playground that is designed specifically for public observation. This whole setup was like a zoo, but for people. They had like this whole gallery set up where tourists could look at the sisters behind one-way glass and screens. But it didn't exactly keep the noise out. Visitors were once again asked to stay quiet and keep moving, but shockingly, they didn't. And so they could often be heard screaming, laughing, and just making a general ruckus, having a good time, enjoying themselves. And the girls were brought to this playground 2 or 3 times per day so that the crowds could come and watch them. Now, by all accounts, the one-way glass that was supposed to muffle sound and keep the girls from being able to see people was little more than like frosted glass. And so as the girls grew older, they did realize that they were being watched constantly. And over time, their playtime turned into a full-on performance. The Dionne sisters were also constantly being tested, studied, and examined by scientists at the compound. They would x-ray them and record their daily lives in extreme detail, from what they ate all the way down to the tantrums that they threw. They were literally living their lives under a microscope. While living at the compound, they were not required to participate in chores and were privately tutored in the same building where they lived. They were being cared for primarily by nurses and had limited exposure to the world outside the boundaries of the compound, except for, of course, the daily rounds of tourists. They had occasional contact with their parents and siblings who still lived just across the street, but the Quints were not allowed to visit the farmhouse. Their parents had to come and visit them at the nursery if they wanted to see them, but the nurses never left them alone with the girls, and so it was a constant struggle. Their mother often didn't like the way that the nurses handled things with her girls, and she often objected to the foods that her daughters were being fed. This meant, of course, that their interactions were always super tense, probably by design, and the parents started to visit the girls less and less, until eventually they only saw the Quints for publicity photos.
Not even the war can dim Canada's tourist attraction number 1, the Dionne Quintuplets. The famous 5 are now 6, and demure little ladies they are. Can you pick out Yvonne, Annette, Emile, Cecile, and Marie? They're just like peas in a pod.
The girls even wrote about this in their book called When We Were 5. They said, "We dwelt at the center of a circus, a carnival set in the middle of nowhere." Well, good golly, thank goodness for the government stepping in and stopping them from being exploited, am I right? Let's talk about this super rigid daily routine that these poor girls were living through because, wow, every single day was planned out. First, they were woken up, given orange juice and cod liver oil. Yum. And then they had their hair curled. After that, they'd say a prayer, and then a gong sounded. Yes, a literal gong. And they would sit down to breakfast. After 30 minutes, they were to clear the table, and then they played in the sunroom for 30 minutes before taking a 15-minute break. Then at 9 o'clock, they had their morning inspection with Dr. DaFoe, and the rest of the day was spent being privately tutored or playing in the playground. Every month, they had a different timetable of activities. They took their baths every day before dinner, then put on their pajamas, and dinner was served precisely at 6 o'clock. They then went into the quiet playroom to say their evening prayers. Each girl had a color and a symbol to mark whatever things belonged to her, and they also dressed them in a particular color and symbol. Since they were identical, this was supposed to help the visitors that came to Quintland to identify who was who. Annette was dressed in red with a maple leaf. Cecile was dressed in green with a turkey. Emily was dressed in white with a tulip. Marie was dressed in blue with a teddy bear. And Yvonne was dressed in pink with a bluebird. They had no time just to be kids. It's almost like they were the first reality TV show kids, except the cameras never went off. Okay, so a normal day at Quintland would bring in about 3,000 visitors, but on holiday weekends, that number could double to 6,000 people per day. Now, here's one of the weirdest parts of this whole thing for me. As much as all of this was all about money, clearly, people were never charged admission to actually get in to see the girls. That was free. All of the money was made from all the extra things that were surrounding the girls, like the photos of them, advertisements, sponsorships, all those other things that we're going to get into in a minute. But I just thought that was really interesting. Even crazier is the fact that they built a huge infrastructure all around this. The area where the girls were born is apparently like Timbuktu, and so they actually built a 6-lane highway just so that tourists could get to Quintland. Let that sink in for a second. A 6-lane highway out in the middle of nowhere just for Quintland. Now, back during that time period, only about 40% of Canadians could afford cars. And so this meant that the people who could actually make it out to Quintland were the ones who had money to burn. So as these things go, where there's attention, there's a market. So naturally, souvenir shops started popping up all around Quintland. They were selling souvenirs with the girls' faces on them, along with stands either giving away or selling stones that had been taken from the Dionne farm that were supposed to promote fertility. The Quints' father even got in on this action, opening his own souvenir shop next to Quintland, where he sold memorabilia picturing the 5 girls. Those included framed photographs, spoons, cups, plates, plaques, candy bars, books, postcards, dolls, and he even gave autographs for 25 cents. And he also started selling stones from his property. And since people thought everything from the Dionne property had some kind of magical fertility powers, they were obsessed with these stones. Women were even reaching out and touching Elzira in hopes that it would help them to have a baby. Now, speaking of babies, the Dionnes went on to have 3 more children after the Quints, which meant they ended up with a total of 14 kids. Now, at the same time that all of this is going on with Quintland, there was also something called the Great Stork Derby in Canada, which this was totally new to me. You guys will have to let me know in the comments if you've heard of this before, but apparently this was a whole thing where families in Toronto would try to have the most babies possible in a 10-year period in hopes of winning a huge fortune. And it's believed that this derby also added to the intrigue of the whole Quintland experience, as some couples may have been making a special trip out just in the hopes of boosting their chances of winning this fortune. Even the 2 midwives who had helped to deliver the quintuplets got in on the action. Apparently, the 2 of them worked at 5 different souvenir shops during this time. Between 1936 and 1943, approximately 3 million people came out to see the Dionne girls at Quintland, making them more popular than Niagara Falls. Some of that time period's biggest stars came to see the quintuplets. This included Clark Gable, James Stewart, Betty Davis, James Cagney, Mae West, and even Amelia Earhart made a special trip out to see the Dionne quintuplets just a couple of months before she disappeared over the Pacific Ocean. Like, that's how big Quintland was. In the words of one of the sisters, Cecile, it was a total circus. Now, since there's no question that this was all about the money, we might as well talk numbers. It's estimated that Quintland generated as much as $500 million in tourist revenue to Ontario in the 9 years that it was open. In fact, Quintland is credited with literally keeping Ontario from going bankrupt during the Great Depression. In addition to being plastered all over postcards, dishes, and dolls, which, side note, their dolls outsold Shirley Temple dolls 5-1. I mean, Shirley Temple. Considering how incredibly popular and famous she was, that is wild to me. Anyway, it wasn't just souvenir items. The Dionne girls were also used to endorse all kinds of products like Quaker Oats, Palmolive, Beehive, golden syrup, toothpaste, candy bars, and even war bonds. Like, these girls were everywhere and the business was booming. Everyone wanted in on that sweet, sweet Dionne girl money. In 1935, 2 corn syrup companies, the St. Lawrence Starch Company and the Canada Starch Company of Montreal, actually sued each other because they both wanted to be the official syrup of the quintuplets. I mean, can you imagine? They were fighting over which syrup would be the one to slaver on those girls' pancakes. The sisters later wrote, "Money was a monster. So many around us were unable to resist the temptation." Some companies were even straight up trying to cash in without actually having to pay the licensing fees. For example, Heinz ketchup, they came out with this ad featuring 5 tomatoes with faces on them. I mean, it was clear to everyone that this was supposed to be the Quints. And even Walt Disney himself, he jumped on the bandwagon, making a Pluto cartoon where Pluto had his own Quintuplets. Like, really, basically trying to profit out this whole spectacle without paying any royalties. And now everyone's doing it to him on Etsy, so karma, I guess. At this point, the Dionne Quintuplets are literally the most photographed girls in the entire world. From the moment they were born, their struggle for survival became this huge symbol of hope during the Great Depression. The sight of these 5 identical, beautiful babies became a regular occurrence in newspapers across the globe, and it got to where people expected to see them, especially during the holidays and big celebrations. But the really sad part about all of this is that the photos everyone were seeing weren't even close to the reality that the girls were living. They created this fairy tale version of the girls' lives, which was so far from what they were actually living. In the 1996 documentary Miracle Babies, Annette said, "People think we have a perfect life. They want us always smiling. They don't see us as human." The exclusive contracts on the Newspaper Enterprises of America, or the NEA, were worth $117,000 or about $2 million in today's money. Now, like I said earlier, these contracts were so tight that no one could take pictures of these girls. Not even their own parents could take pictures without permission. Now, they also sold the rights to photograph the entire family together, which ended up leading to this weird situation where there are no photos of the entire family all together between 1938 and 1939, thanks to conflicting copyright issues. One guy could take pictures of only the girls, and one could only take pictures of the whole family. So as you can imagine, like, the two things caused problems, right? Because they both would be inflicting on each other's copyright if they were to take a picture of the family together. So for the 9 years that the girls were living in the Quintland nursery compound between 1934 and 1943, they only left the nursery twice because the Board of Guardians and the Ontario government could not risk anyone sneaking a photo of them in public and breaching their contract. Like, that's how serious this was. So instead, the girls spent their childhood locked up in a nursery with tourists peering at them through the windows or watching them on their playground. They weren't seen as human beings. They were a commodity. Now, the public was obsessed with seeing the girls doing normal things like celebrating holidays. But as we've mentioned before, all of those photos totally staged. The girls would pose with cardboard Valentine hearts, fake pumpkins for Halloween, or sit on Santa's lap, who might have been Dr. DaFoe in disguise. And their birthday photos, you guys, I'm showing you a photo right now, if you're watching on YouTube, of the young girls standing around a mound of presents in their nursery. And it turns out all of those gifts were empty boxes, which, interestingly enough, in this photograph, you can actually see photography equipment in the edges of the photo, which kind of accentuates the false reality that the girls were living in versus what the public saw. And the cake, just a piece of cardboard with a big hole in the middle. Cecile said it was always like that. They would cut it, but there was never any cake. Now, the anticipation from the public for these photos was very high. And in order to guarantee that the newspapers and magazines across the world would get these photos in time, the girls had to act out all of these scenes weeks in advance of the actual holiday. And although they did have the opportunity to celebrate events like their birthdays with family on the actual day, they said the significance of these celebrations were diminished because they had already acted the whole thing out before. It's like it ruined the specialness. The chance for the girls to celebrate these different celebrations and occasions in an authentic manner as children were taken away by corporations who were only interested in cashing the checks they knew the images of these little girls would bring. Now, the Ontario government and the Board of Guardians really wanted the public to believe that these girls lived in the nursery because it was the best place to keep them safe, happy, and healthy. And to perpetuate this belief, the photos of these girls were meant to show that they were living this fairy tale life as princesses with the best of everything. And this became especially important as the girls grew older and pressure began to mount from the Dionne family to have their daughters returned to them. But reuniting the girls with their family would result in the loss of a $500 million asset. $9 billion in today's money. And the government was not about to lose their cash cow. So they kept the girls away from their family, showing the world a picture-perfect fairy tale life to keep the money rolling in. It wasn't about their well-being at all at this point. It was all about the cash. The whole thing was an industry, and the girls were just the product. When the Dionne Quintuplets were just 2 years old, they were turned into movie stars. Their first movie, called The Country Doctor, had a plot about a small-town doctor who, shocker, was based on Dr. DaFoe. This country doctor had delivered 5 babies and became a national hero, but barely got any credit for all of his hard work. He just loved his patients and he did it for the love of it. The movie was a massive hit, pulling in $1.4 million in the box office, which was be about $30 million in today's money. And just to top it all off, there was a sequel that came out that same year. The Quintuplets filmed for 1 hour a day for 26 days, and $83,000 was paid to their trust fund. At this point, their trust fund was sitting at roughly around $250,000. But unfortunately, back then, there were no laws to stop the Guardians from dipping into the trust funds for basically anything. So the government and the Guardians were like, let's use some of this cash for food, travel, photographers, filmmakers, and don't forget those fancy dinners with dignitaries. They were supposed to be paying for the stuff for the girls and then setting aside money for the girls separately in this trust fund, but instead they were using the trust fund to pay for all the other things. So fast forward to May 31st, 1938, and the girls were on the cover of Time magazine. Then that next year, they were filming their third movie. This one was called Five of a Kind, and it showed a way too perfect version of their lives. Basically, the world's idea of the ideal quintuplets.
This is Christine Nelson bringing you the newsreel of the air from Moosetown, Canada. Today, for the first time, you will hear those 5 little international sweethearts broadcasting directly from their play yard in the Luke Hospital.
Of course, the girls themselves had no clue just how different their daily lives were compared to other kids. They spent their childhood growing up in a compound, isolated from the outside world, and as they got older, that isolation really started to hit them. 30 years later, they wrote, "We were a club, society, a civilization, all our own." Of course, as I mentioned briefly earlier, it wasn't just the Dionnes who became celebrities. Dr. DaFoe suddenly found himself in the spotlight as well due to his association with the Quints, which, now that I know he made 3 movies about himself, it's like, maybe it's because you were making movies and making yourself the star. Regardless, he soon spent very little time at his own medical practice and instead dedicated himself to Quintland. Now, while the Dionne parents were painted out as villains in the media, probably to make sure the government could keep these girls, Dr. DaFoe was painted as like the perfect hero. He was basically the father figure for the girls, which is why you would always see him in these staged photo shoots we talked about earlier. I really feel like this guy started with good intentions, but it did start to become questionable later on because pretty soon he was rolling in the dough. He became super wealthy from being the guardian to the Quints, and he was scoring commercial endorsements, speaking fees, and even writing books. Oh, and we can't forget his radio show. He was all about giving moms advice on how to care for their babies. The guy was everywhere, and his radio show broadcast was even sponsored by brands like Lysol wipes. And so he went from being this small town country doctor to being seen as a top expert on child care and health. People were obsessed with him, especially at that time when they were really hungry for a professional childcare advice. He was basically their parenting guru. However, over time, people did start to notice that Dr. DaFoe might kind of be milking this whole fame thing a little too much. He was spending money like crazy, and eventually that led to him being removed as one of the primary caregivers of the girls, which was due in part to the fact that Oliva Dionne had taken legal action to try to regain custody of his girls. Despite all the drama, Dr. DaFoe was still widely seen as an amazing doctor by the public. And what they didn't know was that in the year 1943 alone, he made a staggering $182,466 off the girls' fame, which is equivalent to about $3.1 million today. He too was making bank off those little girls. So, on May 22nd, 1939, the Quints took a special air-conditioned train to Toronto to meet King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. But because of those copyright situations that I mentioned earlier, they were not allowed to take a photograph with the King and Queen. How wild is that? Even the King and Queen were not legally allowed to get a photograph with these girls because the proper photographer wasn't there. That very same year, the Dionne parents start really pushing to try to regain custody of their girls. It took them 4 long years, but they eventually succeeded in gaining back custody in 1943. By this point, Dr. DaFoe had passed away, the girls were 9 years old, World War II had started, and Quintland attendance was down. The novelty and cuteness had finally started to wear off. 3 years into their legal battle, Oliva and Desire dipped into the girls' trust fund and built an 18 or 19 room mansion. I saw both. Around this time, the trust fund was worth about $1 million, even with all of the expenses that had been being taken out over the last 8 years. And of course, now they had the cost of this huge mansion as well. So in 1943, when they regained custody of the girls move into this mansion, which became known as the Big House. This expansive family home had a boarding school on the property for the sisters and 10 other girls of the same age from all across Canada. 4 nuns and a Monsignor staffed the school. Now, the transition from living in Quintland to going to the Big House was rough. The girls said that their father treated them not as family, but as a prize that he had won from the government. The sisters wrote decades later, "We were transferred to the Big House like a conquered army." After living in the sterile, almost zoo-like conditions of Quintland, they were suddenly thrown into a big rural, gotta use your throat. They were suddenly thrown into this big rural family home, and it was super awkward. The sisters didn't fit in with their other siblings. They all spoke English and the Quints only spoke French. And to make matters even worse, their parents seemed super bitter about the whole situation. And although the Quints continued to make appearances and earn money for the families, their parents forced them to serve meals to the rest of the family and do more chores than the other 5 children. As the girls themselves put it, there was so much more money than love in our existence. They said the Big House was the saddest home that they had ever known, which is so sad. Can you imagine? They lived in like this fake hospital like situation, and this was much, much worse than that. It really felt like their parents blamed them for all of the bad things that had come out of this whole situation, but at the same time, they didn't give them credit for any of the good, like the money that was supporting the entire family. The sisters later wrote, "We were drenched with a sense of having sinned from the hour of our birth." The Quints stated their mother was physically abusive to them, while their father constantly wanted the attention they received and took them to perform at functions to just further pad his bank account. The sisters stated, "Mom and Dad behaved toward each other as though they had been partners in some unspoken crime to bring us into the world." Later in life, the Quints stated that their father had SA'd them as teenagers. The girls came to dread car rides alone with him and often wore turtlenecks to prevent his unwanted attention. When Annette told a clergyman about the abuse, he allegedly told her, quote, "It is bad in effect, but it is not up to you to judge your father," end quote. The only advice he gave her was to wear a thick coat on drives. That always makes me so angry. Like when a kid reaches out to someone and they don't listen, it's like completely unacceptable. Meanwhile, when the Quints were 16, they were put on display once again for money. In October 1950, they went to New York where huge crowds welcomed them. A year later, in 1951, they met Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip when they toured Canada.
At North Bay, Ontario, the Empire's famous twosome meets our country's famous fivesome, the Dionne Quintuplets. They drove from their home in Callender to see this princess that to this moment had been but a newsreel picture.
On January 28, 1952, they appeared at a parade in St. Paul, Minnesota. Then in that evening, they went to a party held by a calendar company that printed Dionne Quintuplet calendars in Hudson, Wisconsin. This happened when they were just a few months away from turning 18. So the moment the Dionne Quintuplets turned adults, they were like, "Peace out. We're done with this." They packed up and got away from their parents as quickly as they could. Now, I mean, I feel like I just keep saying sadly, this whole thing is sad, but another astonishing thing is that even though these girls had private tutors all growing up in Quintland until 9 years old, they weren't taught like basic life skills. They had never even handled money before, and so they go out on their own at 18 and they can't even tell the difference between a nickel and a dime. Like, can you imagine? That had to be super embarrassing and frustrating all at the same time. So in 1952, they all decide that they want to get an actual education, and they all enroll at the Nicolette Convent, each picking different courses. Yvonne quickly decided that art was what she was into, and so she dropped out to follow her passion. Meanwhile, Marie also decided that she wanted to leave school to become a nun. Then in 1954, tragedy struck. The sister Emily had a seizure at the convent. She was alone and no one was there to help her, so she ended up suffocating. She was only 20 years old. The world was shocked. The news spread fast, and 500 people showed up to her funeral.
Emily was not yet 21, and her death will be deeply felt not only by her sisters, but by all those near to her.
Yet, even this was taken as an opportunity to exploit these poor young women. The photographers at the funeral had the 4 other sisters pose next to Emily or Emile's body in the coffin. Like, who does that? And to make the whole situation even sadder, the family knew that Emile had epilepsy, but her condition was hidden from the public in order to keep their perfect image going. And so the sisters had tried to get help, but the family had refused because they didn't want anyone to find out that she had epilepsy. The other sisters were so overwhelmed with grief, and in their 1965 book, called We Were Five, the sisters wrote, "Epilepsy does not kill people. It did not kill Em. She died as a consequence of being alone, with no one at her side to take care of her. We never left her like that at home." They always had each other, but the first time she was away on her own, this happens. All because this family wanted to keep a perfect image rather than getting their daughter the help she needed. In 1955, at the age of 21, the girls were finally given access to their trust fund. But surprise, surprise, it was practically empty at that point. The trust fund had once been worth millions, but by then, the alleged caretakers had dipped into it for years, leaving the girls just a fraction of what they deserved. Now, no one knows exactly how much was still in there, but once this was split 4 ways, it didn't last more than a few years. Between 1956 and 1957, Marie, Annette, and Cecile got married. All 3 of these marriages ended in divorce. Marie, however, did have 2 daughters, one of whom she named after her sister, Emily. Marie also went on to open a flower shop in 1956, which she also named Emily after her sister and her daughter. Unfortunately, this flower shop eventually failed, and Marie fell on hard times. Annette had 3 sons and became a librarian. Cecile had 5 children, including 1 set of twins, and as a single mother, she became a nurse, which helped her to be able to provide her children with everything they needed. Yvonne remained unwed, but also became a nurse and then a librarian in her adult life. When asked why she never married, she stated that she never saw much love when she was young, and that had influenced her decision. So in 1965, when the sisters were 31, they dropped their book called We Were Five. It gave a peek into their isolated childhood and how it really messed with them emotionally. But this book did not mention the SA that they had suffered at the hands of their father. Now, you would think that people would read this and be like, wow, these girls had a really tough life. But nope, the press did not care. One publication literally said, like, who cares if their story's true or not? Nobody's gonna feel bad for somebody who airs their family's dirty laundry for profit. Like, seriously, wow. Like, how do you miss that all of this was done to them for profit? Are you, like, get real, man? But the girls weren't looking for fame. Far from it. They really just wanted to be left alone, and they kept their lives super low-key. They really didn't even do very many media interviews. They kind of just wanted a chance to tell their side of the story. Unfortunately, their dark days were not over yet. In February of 1970, they couldn't reach Marie. Now, she had been struggling with depression. Her children had been recently taken and placed in foster care. And the sisters were really worried. So they had her doctor go out to check on her, and he found that she had passed away several days earlier. No one knew exactly how she had died, but doctors speculated that it was likely a blood clot in her brain. The 5 were now 3. Then in 1978, the documentary The Dionne Quintuplets came out. This was made by Donald Britton. Now, it was mostly just old newsreels and footage, but Britton didn't interview the surviving sisters. He knew they probably didn't want to relive all of their trauma, and the reason he gave for not interviewing them is that he wanted to respect their privacy. A year after that, their dad passed away in 1979, and then their mom passed away in 1986. The big house where the family had lived eventually got turned into a retirement home. And for years, their surviving sisters stayed super low-key, keeping a quiet life. By the 1990s, they were living together in an apartment, getting by on a combined income of $746 a month. But in the mid-1990s, they dropped a bombshell with the Dionne Quintuplets Family Secrets. This book was a huge deal because it finally exposed the physical and sexual abuse they had suffered growing up. And this time, people actually listened. The media finally gave them the attention they deserved, and the response to the book was a lot more positive than they had gotten for We Were Five and that they had put out in 1965. Then on June 23rd, 2001, Yvonne passed away from cancer. Annette spoke to the press saying she was very special, though very frail. She was strong inside. It will be hard to be without her. As of the recording of this video, 2 of the 5 sisters are still alive. And if you're wondering what happened to the trust fund, well, the surviving sisters finally got what they were owed in one small way. So if we go back to the mid-1990s, there were 3 surviving sisters at that time, and they were done being ignored. They asked the Canadian government for a $10 million payout for all of the exploitation they had endured, and they received no response from the government. Like, seriously? I mean, honestly, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but it's kind of just like the audacity. So the sisters start talking to the media, which helped to get some attention on the case. And so this is when their book came out, spilling all the tea about their dramatic childhoods. And this is when public pressure finally started to get to the government. So during all of this, Cecile's son discovers that there were documents from 1934 to 1937 relating to the Quints that had been destroyed. And these documents would really have helped the sisters' case. So what did the government do? Well, Premier Mike Harris stepped in. He's like, okay, we'll give you guys $2,000 a month. And the sisters were like, no thanks. I mean, $2,000 a month, that was pennies compared to what was actually owed to them from their trust fund that had been mishandled for all of those years. You got to do better than that. So then they upped the offer to $2 million. Nope, still not enough. And then they're like, all right, how about $3 million? And the sisters are like, nah, we're good. We're going to keep waiting. Finally, they came back with an offer of $4 million and a promise to investigate the trust accounts, which I always love when the government investigates themselves. So the girls were like, okay, we'll take it. And so Premier Harris even visits them personally to apologize on behalf of the Ontario government, which, I mean, about time, but also I never get sincerity out of forced apologies, so whatever. So the original Dionne homestead was moved to a new location and eventually was turned into a nonprofit called the Dionne Quintuplets Museum. A second museum, the Calendar Bay Heritage Museum, also features many artifacts from the Dionne Quintuplets and is located in the previous home of Dr. DaFoe. As for Cecile and Annette, the two surviving sisters, they're living super quietly, doing their own thing, trying to stay as far away from the spotlight as possible. This whole time, all I could think about was family vloggers. I bet some of you guys were thinking the same thing. The parallels here are honestly astonishing. Now, we could also think of, reality TV and stuff like that. And even though that stuff still exists, I feel like family vlogging is probably something that's a little more prevalent in our society. And so I go there even before the reality TV. But it could also just be because I don't watch reality TV. I mean, not that I watch family vloggers, but that kind of stuff's always in your face, Anyway, I just find these parallels between these two things to be so astonishing, even down to the play acting and the sponsorships. So later in life, the Dionne sisters actually did come out and warn parents about the dangers of exploiting their children for fame. They've lived through the worst of it themselves, and they're now determined to prevent other children from facing the same fate. As much as they desperately want to stay out of the spotlight, they've worked hard to try and keep their story alive in order to highlight just how damaging it can be when profits are prioritized over the well-being of children.